Hi, it's Rachel with Stirring the Deep. I want to talk a little bit about Adam and Eve, okay? Because they've been so overlooked in the streets of Jerusalem, meaning where God's people should be. It's like in that the messaging and the conversation, they're so neglected, and they are first of all, they weren't born. They're like the only ones that weren't born, except for Melchizedek, right? Which was a representation of Christ. God made them, okay, and they had an incredible unity because Eve came out of Adam. There was that oneness of flesh, and that was very significant in showing us several things. One is how God wanted to make man in his image, male and female. And the two parts are showing us the two parts of God, which you also see as the king and the priest, which you saw Christ was both those roles, the high priest, but also our king. And I've talked about before how the priest is the one that establishes the truths, and the king reigns by them. And you see this as a dynamic of God, meaning he has a part of him. He's just showing the purity of his spirit, that when he creates truths is so pure. It's not corrupted by the fact that he reigns by them. Okay? And when you have it in two separate entities, you see the purity of that. And the truths being created aren't corrupted because that part can't reign by them. All right, so when you see it in two separate people, you see the purity of that spirit. But this is what you see the reflection of Adam and Eve. They were a part of each other. So in a sense, you have both king and priest in you because that's what the fullness of God is. Yet it also is shown in the two components. And so Eve was this priest side, okay, where she was an establisher of truth. And I talked about that feminine side, that female side that's a reflection of God, is the establisher of truth. It's like that spirit that is the wisdom that you see in the Proverbs, and that's why it has that feminine sense to it, okay? It's establisher of truth. Where the male side, the king side, is what reigns and governs by that. But see, they're totally in submission to one another. Do you see? It's the perfect submission when you have those two elements. So Eve, this is what's so interesting when you understand this dynamic between them, because when you go back to her deception, she fell for the fact that she could somehow have the wisdom like God does to know good and evil. So if you are the establisher of truth, so you're that wisdom, it's that temptation, and this is what we all have, okay? And that's my point in this, is that we all have that desire, okay, if only we knew all the truth, all the wisdom, then we could live by it. I could act by it, right? And that was what she was thinking, okay? Man, to have more discernment, to have more of that, that would be great because that would help me to be all that I need to be. So I actually think her motive was pretty pure in a sense in what she did. And because you see this reflected later on, okay? And so that's why Adam trusted her, because that was her role. And so when she said, hey, take this fruit, hey, take this word, this doctrine, this understanding, that's why he partook of that and said, well, that makes sense that we would have that kind of discernment, that we had that kind of knowledge, because I could better reign. So he fell into that too, even though God had said, hey, no, don't go there. They were like, well, why not? It seems like this would be better. Like we would be more proficient at our jobs as establishing and multiplying and everything on this earth if we had that wisdom, if we had that knowledge, like God. Okay? So huge temptation. And the thing is, they could fall for that because they didn't understand going against God's ways and death, because none of that existed. But that's exactly where it led to. Because here's a thing that you learn about how we're really to be with God, is that wisdom is important. We're told to seek wisdom, to seek truth, because that is a part of who God is. So we are seeking that wisdom and that understanding. And as I said, the pure wisdom of God always leads you to what is most loving. Okay? And so you're always seeking, what does that mean? Okay, honor. Okay, that's what honoring, and what does honor mean? And how do I really be loving, and all this stuff. So we can gain all this wisdom. However, for this next present moment, you have to trust God to create that in perfection, and He will use, and it will totally correspond with that wisdom. And that wisdom is part of what helps that creation come in, but you have to trust Him to do that, because He's all-knowing. He knows how to apply that, whatever, all that wisdom perfectly in that moment. We don't. So the moment that we want to get all the wisdom and then be the creators and of our own, we're not in that humility and humbling our spirit and submitting to the sovereignty of God as God in our life. He is the one that has to establish each moment, because He knows the beginning and the end. He knows how to do it perfectly. He knows everything that's happening in that moment. So even though we may be gaining wisdom, we don't then go off on our own. We then have to go to the next step and say, okay, God, I desire, and this wisdom is amazing because it's all part of that next moment coming into being. But you have to trust God as a child. A child just delights in the present moment. They're not concerned about the future. Okay? We have to be the same way. I'm not gaining all this wisdom to create what I want. I want God to create every next present moment. And this is where Solomon, this was also a picture of, Solomon was a great picture of this, okay? Because he prayed for wisdom, and how awesome that was, to a prayer. But he needed to go a bit further and let God establish every present moment. And he didn't. That's why he went astray with all his wives, right? Because he was gaining this wisdom, but he wasn't letting God create the present moments perfectly. So if you don't do that, you just end up going further and further and further off the path, because you're doing it in your own limited understanding. So this is a huge aspect to understanding your own life, that yes, you're seeking that wisdom and that communion, and you're gaining that wisdom, and that is very, very important, because that all helps you to understand what you're doing in this present moment, how it's coming about, and all these things. But for each actual moment, you're letting God do it. And that's why you're at rest. You cease from your works like God did. Today, enter His rest. So that's where I said your expectations, you can't be of images. You know, you want to be a teacher. A lot of people think, okay, well, that means I go to school and I do this, or I can be a teacher in these. Who knows how that's going to look? Just follow those desires as a child, okay? And then let God create what that looks like in your life. But that's where you let each moment, let Him establish your steps. That's what it says over and over. And this is the part of wisdom that a lot of people don't understand. And that's how sometimes that knowledge can puff up, right? But once you understand love, and that's that communion with God where you are submitting to Him and you know that He totally loves you, and you trust that love to create perfection in your life. Because that's how you can let Him establish your next present moment, because you trust Him, because you know His love. Okay? That's why knowledge without love doesn't work. Because you have to understand that love and let go and let God establish each next moment. So this is what was happening with this temptation with Eve and Adam. Okay, that's what it was about. And that's what you saw played out in Solomon's life. Okay, now when you saw Christ, the King, what did He do? He did nothing of His own will. He said, I don't do anything of my own. I do the Father's will. That's it. He was showing us that perfect union of king and priest within His Spirit. He had that wisdom of God. Okay, He had that knowledge, but yet He was letting God create His present reality. That's where He knew what He had to do, and He submitted to the will of God. Okay, and that's the understanding ultimately that we all have to come to, is we have to seek that truth, that pure wisdom of God. We have to, because the words are life. That's what gives us life. We need the wisdom of God, because that's how we actually function and think in every thought. And we know what thoughts are good, and what taking every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, that's what it means. And to that, every thought is of that wisdom. And then even in that doesn't mean you operate on your own, but it means that you're still trusting God to create every single present moment, because that is the love and that's the understanding of the love bond that you have with him. And this is the reconciliation that had to happen within Adam and Eve. They both had to come to this understanding, okay, about what the obedience was that was required of them, okay? And this whole union that was happening with them and God, and then they had to come back together in that unity. And that's where Christ is going to the beginning to reconcile all of that, okay? And that is symbolic of everything that's happening in us. And at that, when that happens, when you come into that awareness of the priest and king, even within your own soul, that is coming back into the full, that unity with God, and that curse is lifted. Life can flow. Life can be created because you're letting the Creator create, and he is life, and that's what he creates. Till next time, keep stirring the deep. It's the one thing that changes everything else.